Welcome to our third lecture in contemporary theological issues. Today we'll be talking about deism. The last couple of lectures we talked about, first of all, theology and doctrine and how they fit together as two separate components. And then we looked at theism, specifically monotheism and polytheism and pantheism. Today we're going to look at deism. Deism is a little different, and that's why we're dedicating an entire lecture to what it is. It is not a thing of the past, even though it is fairly young in the sense of philosophies ago. Deism presents a creator who creates everything and then leaves it to its own moral laws. So the aspect of having a supreme being or a God or something bigger than us as humanity is an obvious necessity in deistic philosophy. Henry Theisen, in his book Lectures on Systematic Theology, says this: "In deism, God is present in creation only by his power and not by his very nature and being," which basically says exactly what we said before, that God has left his creation simply to rule itself by its own moral law. Now, if creation was moral, that would be fine, but creation has fallen from grace and fallen from righteousness through the work of Adam and Eve in the garden, and so we are not moral. A lot of people say, well, did God not create a perfect world? Yes, he did, but it decayed with the sin of mankind, and we see that by reading the first few chapters of the book of Genesis. This is not hard to figure out. It's simply something we have to adjust with. That does not eliminate nature pointing to God as its creator, but it certainly does not leave us with a perfect world. Deism is not a religion, it is a philosophy. In other words, people don't get together at the local deist church. You either adapt the philosophy and live by it, or you don't, because it's not something you can just say, well, I'm a deist. Although some people do say they are deists, most people are deists and don't realize it. And by the way, there are a lot of deists that attend Christian churches, just like there's a lot of agnostics and even, in some cases, Gnostics. So it's an interesting way that the church kind of has a lot of different things in it. And any congregation on any given weekend meeting is going to probably experience some form of deism in someone in their group. I know in the last 3 congregations that I have been a pastor of, there have been a deist in every one of them. In fact, sometimes 2 or 3. There have been an agnostic. In fact, there usually is a lot of agnostics in every congregation. We don't like to admit that. And of course, once in a while, you'll stumble across a Gnostic too. That's very interesting. Deism was initiated basically during the 1700s and maybe the late 1600s in more of a formal format and a textual setting that was written by a few different people. And we're going to talk about a couple of them and how they set in motion this philosophy of deism, which became very popular, especially during the founding of our nation, the United States of America, in the late 1700s. We see how it came into our country. We see where maybe it started outside of the country, but America was a planned object for a lot of deists, and we'll see how that unfolds here in just a few moments. One of those key initiators of the deistic philosophy was a gentleman by the name of Sir Francis Bacon. He lived from 1561 to 1626. He was a statesman, he was a scholar, he was a philosopher. He was a native of London, England, and fell into good grace with the royal family. Some people even said he was part of the royal family. We're not sure about that, so we generally don't make that statement. As a fact, he attended Trinity College in Cambridge, and so he had a religious education as well as a legal education. And he came about of age just about the time the Reformation in the continent of Europe, and of course the English Reformation, the formation of the Anglican Church was just in its small beginnings, shall we say, at that point. Calvin and Zwingli would have been pretty much out of the picture, and of course Luther was long out of the picture by the time Francis Bacon stepped into his prime. He was best known for his esoteric philosophy, and esotericism is a very interesting form of thought and communication. Esotericism is wrapped around the unknown or the undefined. It never quite finds a descriptive resolution to anything it's discussing. Esotericism strives for the ultimate and absolute truth, but yet, by definition, the truth is unattainable. In other words, the absolute truth is just out there somewhere, and we're almost there. We've just about got it. An example of that today is if you watch the documentaries on unidentified flying objects. They never quite pin one of them down. They know they're out there. They think they're out there. They try to give you what they call is evidence and rationale and logic for why they're there, but we can't really put our finger on one of them and say, there they are, there it is, that's who they are. That's kind of esoteric, and you see a lot of esoteric thought and philosophy in those documentaries. If you want a current example in contemporary, shall we say, works of literature. Esotericism declares that if you know what's really going on, if you're really tuned in, if you know, as the song says, what is hap, in a particular situation, an event, or with an organization or group of people, a body of people that make up a group, you're better off than those who don't know what's going on. So there's a level of achievement, there's a level of stepping up above everyone else. And that usually is seen in some type of esoteric knowledge, secrets, codes, might even become in recondite rituals and things like that. So, esotericism was what Bacon was especially known for. He is best known for one of his literary works called The New Atlantis. In the book, he describes the potential of a paradise island where sin and immorality have been eliminated and all the inhabitants are ruled in a peaceful state, and in his words, by a Rosicrucian order. And a Rosicrucian order is simply a very esoteric group of people with some format of religious thought. There are Rosicrucians today, and we find them in different areas of the United States. However, they don't generally practice a religion. It's like Deism. It's a format of that. They tend to be more of like what we'd probably call a fraternal group, a lodge, things like that. And they're very secretive and very sparse in the United States, but they seem to have a lot of influence on other organizations and also on politics, as we'll find out later on in these series of lectures, especially when we look at some history behind the church. To understand why he wrote the book, The New Atlantis, we must understand what Atlantis is. And Atlantis is a legendary island that was said to have submerged following an earthquake or an explosion or something like that nearly 12,000 years ago. Plato describes Atlantis in a myth, and he makes it more of a, we call it a fairy tale, but it's been picked up on over the last 23 to 2,400 years and developed. And of course, during the time of Francis Bacon, and of course, going on into some of the later Masonic philosophers, he wanted to promote the idea of the New World, the North American settlers, as creating the new Atlantis. And so that was kind of a underlying current for the book. And since America had been discovered at the time he was writing, he was trying to promote this idea of, okay, we need to build the new Atlantis, this perfect culture, this perfect society, this prototype world that would live in perfect harmony without God or religion. That's what deism is about, because after all, you don't need God or religion if God has created everything and left it to its own moral laws. And of course, there's a little bit of arrogance involved in that when you think you are moral enough to do that. Let's take a moment to define what morality is. We'll talk about it in some later lectures in much more detail. Human morality is based on three sets of opposites. And those three sets of opposites are right and wrong. And that, again, can be relative or absolute. It should be absolute from the spiritual standpoint and from the relationship to God through Christ. It is absolute, right and wrong. Also healthy and unhealthy, and that mainly primarily deals with our relationships. And what is a healthy relationship? What is an unhealthy relationship? And that can be to other people or in other environments or to other things. And so we look at that generally in that context. And then we have to also, excuse me, we have to look at the third set of opposites as that which is safe and hazardous. And of course, that can vary per individual. What's safe for me might be hazardous for you and still be okay. And so there's some things that create our own personal morality as well as the community's morality, and obviously a global morality or a human morality at that. So Atlantis is this perfect culture of moral law and perfect prototype harmonious living of humanity. The idea of an advanced civilization where learning and scientific research were encouraged and appealed to a lot of these Western rationalists. And of course, this would be found in this object of the Atlantean society. And the culture would consist widely amongst those who attempted to define it over the last few centuries. They were working on what that meant and how that should be placed in this new North American growing community of people. Francis Bacon's literary work, The New Atlantis, fed this new idea called the New World Order. And the New World Order we hear a lot about today. It's become very popular through many of our presidents who have spoke of a New World Order. This goes back to this Atlantean thought of deism, okay? And this whole idea of a one world government, a harmonious world of people living in a perfect culture controlled by those who know how to control it, which generally are the elite few at the top. And we see this very clearly coming through, especially in the Masonic Lodge's projections of the 18th century, the 1700s. And we also see it in the 1800s through one of their prophets or one of their philosophers, a gentleman by the name of Albert Pike, who wrote a lot on the New World Order and various aspects of how the world would come into space or come into place in that New World Order. The New World Order, defined by both Albert Pike and Manly P. Hall, consists of three things. It consists of three pillars, which would be number one, individual freedoms. Number two, the rule of people, in other words, a democratic republican society, and the rule of law. The New World Order ultimately finds its nesting place in the conspiracy theories connected to the Masonic Lodge. We also find the Masonic Lodge also connected to groups like the Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, the Skull and Bones Fraternal Organization. These type of groups all have this issue of the New World Order through the Atlantean philosophy of Francis Bacon, connecting the dots together. And a lot of people say, well, that's just a conspiracy theory. But conspiracy theories are no longer conspiracy theories when the evidence is blatant and the facts can be proven. Sir Isaac Newton lived from 1642 to 1727. He was a British mathematician, a physicist, and a principal source of what we now know as classical science. And that's very interesting because Newton was considered to be a leading intellectual by his contemporaries. And many of those type of people, mathematicians and scientists, still think Newton is one of the preeminent brains, intellectuals of all times. Newton was not content to accept the mystical ideals of the church, and therefore set out to prove things through a rational and a logical manner. Along with the works of René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650, and John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704, Newton was able to effectively promote and advance a new and more accurate understanding of natural science. Religion, and particularly the issues of faith in God, were difficult issues for philosophers and scientists like Newton and Descartes and Locke. They were interested in the rational and the logical, and this fit into the deism quite well, into humanism and this moral law that man could live by and create on his own. The unseen form of faith was just way out there for these guys, and so all of these things were very difficult for them to understand and to comprehend, and so deism became the philosophy of life by which they lived by. Because deism uses largely rationale and logic and rationale that is not based on personal relationship with God is what is probably going to be the most easiest for them to put together. Let me take a few minutes and talk about 5 deists that helped found the United States of America. We'll talk about them in more detail later on, but I just want to mention them in this lecture so that you understand that deism was a large part of the way our nation was founded. The fact that one of the pillars of the New World Order, which sprouts out of deism, is individual freedom should tell you a lot right there. It really should. And yet the church, for the most part, over the last 200 years, has claimed that America was founded to be a Christian nation. It was not. And we don't need that myth to continue. It was founded on personal freedoms. And part of the personal freedoms we should be thankful for, and that is that to practice the religious faith or to worship the God of our choice. And in Christianity, that is obviously the correct God. That is Yahweh, God of the Old Testament, and God the Father, or the Son of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. 5 founding fathers who were deists. John Adams, the 2nd President of the United States, was a Unitarian deist. If you read his letters, you have no problem, no doubt whatsoever discerning his deism through his Unitarian faith. Now, Unitarian is kind of like deism to a certain point. You have to kind of stop and say, okay, well, it's not really a religion because it's so broad spectrum. Thomas Jefferson, who was a friend of John Adams for the last 20 years of their life, communicated serious letters based in deism and anti-theological principles. Okay? Tom Jefferson was a deist of deists. You say, well, he wrote the Declaration of Independence and he talks about the Creator. Exactly. The Creator could be anything to a deist. To a Christian, that's God. To a Jew, that's God. But to Thomas Jefferson, the Creator could apply to a lot of different things to a deist. And so we have to understand what's going on here. He's using language that's flexible. And so many Christians have looked at that and said, oh, he's a Christian, he talks about the Creator. No. Wrong. That's not it at all. Thomas Payne wrote the book Common Sense, which spurred the Revolutionary War. He was a very strong deist and had a very bitter hatred for Christianity and anything that looked and smelled and even had a similar feel to religion that was connected to God and or Jesus Christ. Thomas Payne, on his deathbed, locked himself in his room and surrounded himself by people who believed just like he did in the deistic thought and philosophy because there was a reason why. Because most of the time when someone who was very popular was nearing their death, the local pastors in those communities would try to get a statement of faith from them so they could use that as a testimony. And Thomas Payne was determined that they would not come in and attempt to convert him and or get a statement out of him that they could use for their own benefit. That was how strong of a deist he was. Benjamin Franklin was a deist. He had a church pew in every church in Philadelphia. In other words, he just gave money to places to have his name on the sign, basically, for his business sake. If you look at his life and his association with secret societies, lodges, and fraternal organizations, it is very clear to see that he was probably, to the best we can tell, never a Christian, but lived under a deistic philosophy all his life. George Washington, our first president, we can find a little peace and solace here. Probably was a deist for the first half of his life and probably softened his heart quite a bit towards the end of his life. And there is an account where he was actually baptized and took communion on his deathbed from a Roman Catholic priest, acknowledging Christ as his Savior. We don't know exactly what happened in George Washington's life, but we do know his wife was a very devout practicing Episcopalian, and he did go to church with her occasionally. We do know that he did not attend any Masonic lodges or was ever in a lodge for the last 2 decades of his life. We don't know why. It might have just been it wasn't convenient, he didn't have time, but we do know a letter that he wrote corrected someone who said he was a Grand Master of a lodge, when indeed he said he had not been in one for many years. And deism in the lodges and fraternal organizations is where you will find it basically still today. So those 5 founding fathers were deists in our nation. And that's where a lot of the deism gets perpetuated through the government. Part of the idea of freedom of religion is deism, because you can basically call the Creator whatever God you want him to be, or her. Faith is the difficult part for deism. And of course in Hebrews 11:1, it describes faith as the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And here's where the line in the sand comes. Faith does not operate in the sensory perceptions of humanity. Faith operates in the spirit of the man. Through the Holy Spirit, we are Christians because the Holy Spirit lives in us, and we operate by faith. When we operate in the deistic philosophy, we operate strictly by our 5 senses, finding what is rational and what is logical, even though we may believe in a God, whatever that God is. So what we can see, what we can hear, what we can taste, what we can smell, and what we can touch, that creates logic, rationale for us. And therein is why Thomas Jefferson edited out the 4 Gospels of the New Testament to what was simply easy to define logically and rational, taking out all the miracles, taking out all of the, as he called them, the superstitions of the Christian faith. And he composed what we know as the Jefferson, or the Jeffersonian Bible, was originally called The Life and Morals of Jesus Christ. This is interesting, very interesting for us to understand, because he had an interest in Christ, but he could not jump past the rationale, and he could not jump past the logic to go out in his spirit by faith and believe. So today, American circles of deistic and deism philosophy are best identified and observed probably in fraternal orders, lodges, and civic organizations and clubs. And there's a reason for this, because they want members. If they allow you to believe like you want to believe, you can join their club and it's okay. We see probably the very largest format and understanding and promotion of deism in America today in Freemasons in North America. That's the most glaring example of deism we have. And that is not to say that some people in the lodge are not, they are Christians. Some people are Christians that attend the Masonic Lodge and are members of it. And you can be a Christian and be a Mason. But you must understand the lodge is not a Christian organization. It is rooted solely in deism. And that's why any member can believe in any God they want. It's why when you go into a lodge room in the Oddfellows and the Masonic Order, or any of the other, some of the other fraternal organizations, you will see the Holy Scriptures from different religions all prominently displayed and equally open and available to their members, because that's deism. You can pick your God and believe what you want to believe, but ultimately life is based to a deist on rationale and logic.